So this is Robert Jay Lifton's latest book, Witness for the Extreme, to an Extreme Century. And behind this is my library of Lifton's books. From the left, it's Revolutionary Immortality, then Living and Dying, then Life of the Self, The Genocidal Mentality, Home for the War, and the War, The Nazi Doctors, Death in Life, Psychohistory, The Broken Connection, The Protean Self, Indefensible Weapons, Destroying the World to Save It, and last but not least, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And I have an original hardback. Whoops, lost that. And this is the paperback version. And it's been re-released by the University of South Carolina, I believe, or is it North Carolina? I don't remember. I don't have that version handy. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Lifton, for all your contributions. And now we'll start the interview. Thank you. Bye. Okay.
I put it this way, some of my other work on Hiroshima, on the Vietnam War, anti-war veterans, and on Nazi doctors is, I think, more widely known. And yet, if I give a talk or get involved in a conference on any of those subjects, there are always people who come up to me and say, you know, I want to thank you. When I was a lot younger, I came out of a cult and I read your book, or chapter 22.
Yeah.
And it's rather moving because it's a life process.
And it's equivalent to, on some level, it's like throwing someone a rope who's been drowning and say, you're not crazy, you're not stupid, you just got, swept away by a wave. But you can pull yourself back to land and have a life again. So it's very profound.
My wife, as you know, BJ did a lot of work on the psychology of adoption and adoption reform. And when we had this powerful memorial for her, I spoke briefly and told how I got letter after letter, email after email from people who said she changed their lives. She changed their lives. And in a way, and she did with many, many people. They were very moving. But then, in relation to these people, some of them no longer young, talking about something that happened decades ago, it is a deep personal satisfaction to hear them because it's so directly human, and they indicate, like you, that your life was changed. It means a lot. So that
my life was changed. My sisters, my parents, my entire family. By that
through your emerging from that.
They were mourning a living death, and they were. And some families experience this for decades, where their loved one is in a mind control cult.
And it's an interesting psychological fact that something I came upon, sitting in Hong Kong, studying Chinese communist thought reform, had this new life and fairly direct applicability to an environment that couldn't have been more different geographically and culturally, and yet had that common quality of totalism, absolutism, which seems to translate everywhere. The characteristics translate everywhere.
Yes, exactly. And I don't know how you did it, but your mind was able to see what was important.
Yeah, I guess I tried to extract what seemed most pervasive in general, and what was most pervasive in general was most applied in other places.
Exactly. And now, it's July of 2011. It seems like China is on the ascent in world power and politics and
Well,
finances and...
It's a strange story, because I started my work in connection with China in the mid-50s, and I did the work on thought reform, and at that time, the thought reform process was energized by their revolutionary triumph,
Right.
and they were relatively incorruptible and had moral intensity. Now, a half century later or more, they're among the most corrupt governments in the world. They still reform people, but it's more punitive. It isn't. They couldn't apply it to their whole population; they'd be laughed at. Nobody really takes the ideology seriously, except those at the center, and they modify it enormously. But they still will pull out thought reform or reform by labor, which is worse and often physically abusive, when they're threatened. When they feel threatened as somebody who they think is dangerous to their political control. So the whole scene, and one of the fascinating aspects of thought reform, when I studied it, was, I write about this in my memoir, just the tableau of hundreds of millions of people subjected to a fairly powerful process that ran rather deep. Criticism, self-criticism, confession, enormous group pressure, and nothing like that had ever been done in human history. I was also fascinated at the time by just this idea how much you could succeed in manipulating and controlling people's minds and in changing them coercively. And you could go pretty far, as the Chinese did, and as cultic groups here have done. But it's never absolutely successful. It's, how shall I say, it shouldn't be looked upon as an all-powerful means that cannot be resisted.
I agree.
And I felt with the Chinese, I began to have the feeling, this may happen in some cults also, that they over-reformed. Where the reform was having a kind of, where the thought reform program was having a kind of backlash of resentment, they couldn't stop reforming because it was a religious-like movement, even though they were a secular, group.
If I may respond and just say that I just came back from a cult conference in Barcelona, Spain, and I spent a number of hours with a man who was a former 20-year member and leader of an Iranian terrorist cult group.
I see. Oh, really?
And he's written a book. Masood is his name. Bani Sadr is his name. And basically this group was created as a reaction against the Shah to try to...
Yes, right. Yeah.
And he literally said to me, because I was asking him, what made you leave? Like, what was part of the process? And it's exactly what you were just describing. He said they kept wanting me to get more pure, and there was nothing left.
Yeah.
There was nothing, I couldn't give any more, and it wasn't working anymore. And he had given up his wife, he had given up his child, he was sleeping nothing, and they kept trying to get him to confess to every positive thing that ever happened in his life, and reform himself, and after 20 years he left, he said enough. And now he's speaking out against the group and trying to help people to leave it. This was he is a brilliant man, a mathematician, PhD,
really?
third year student of PhD. He was recruited in the UK. And it just reminded me of Chinese communist brainwashing times 10.
Yeah. It's, of course, a hopeful finding that there's some human resistance to exaggerated control. It's not a guarantee that anything will fail, but it's an ultimate limitation on the capacity to manipulate minds. Unfortunately, the pattern can work or the whole process can work for quite a while and can do a lot of damage.
Yeah, exactly. And before I put on the camera, I was thanking you for helping save my life, basically. And I wanted to just repeat that on tape, that in 1976, literally, your willingness to listen to me and validate my experience and then encourage me to do something good with the terrible experiences that I had had. And it's now 36 years later, and 2 books that I've written that are in numerous languages, and countless people that I've helped rescue out of different groups. But I really owe it to you. You were my mentor. So I really want to thank you.
And it's satisfying to me that someone like you can emerge from that kind of experience, and that my work can be a connection between you and a more constructive life.
And all the people that I help. Every case I do, I'm showing them your book, I'm going over the 8 criteria. And I'm hoping this video will be on the internet, and everyone who's ever read your book will want to read your memoir. And it's called Witness to an Extreme Century.
Exactly, Witness to an Extreme Century.
And I wish we had a copy here to show, but
I've got them upstairs.
Well, maybe later we can grab one and I can film it and splice it into this.
I mentioned before that it's satisfying to me when I talk or be part of a conference of subjects quite removed from thought reform, like Hiroshima, Nazi doctors, or Vietnam War, which I've also studied. People are likely to come up to me from the audience and say something like, well, thanks so much because it helped me emerge from a cult decades ago. And it's a very human interaction, and a nice feeling. It's very direct.
So if I may ask you, when I think I've read about 14 of your books, how many books have you finally written in 2011?
Well, I've written, either by myself or with co-writers, I guess 20 books, and then maybe edited another 8. I counted them up to list them since it was a memoir that covers all of my work. It's not a complete autobiography by any means. I decided to list all of my books, and there are 8 that I edited, and then 2 books of humorous bird cartoons.
Yes,
so if you count all that, it's 30, but it's 20 books of which I've actually written.
And I guess I want to, if I can just jump around a little bit for people who aren't familiar with some of your other books, like the folks that I've shared Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, can I ask you to talk a little bit about death and life?
Sure. I mean,
it won major awards.
My work on thought reform was my first study, and it really enabled me to dig in to the problem of totalism, which was at the heart of thought reform, and helped me develop at an early stage the identity of somebody who works out in the world. And then my work on Hiroshima, a little later, which I did in 1962, well, it really changed my life in a different way, because it created in me a kind of prism or lens through which I saw the world in terms of the danger of nuclear weapons. But it also taught me a lot about the psychology of the survivor and the capacity of people for resilience and to use their trauma and often grotesque experiences as a source of some kind of knowledge.
Yes.
And in a way that's true of people who've been, many people like yourself who have been subjected to cultic influences. You have a certain kind of experience that is valuable and can be communicated. And with Hiroshima, it was an overwhelming kind of immersion, what I call a lifelong immersion in death through that atomic bomb and the stages of fear of radiation, which never end.
And after the tsunami and the reactor problem, they have radiation problems again.
Yes, and it's really tragic that in the same country that was twice victimized by atomic bombings, here's this powerful nuclear accident as coming at the tail end of an earthquake and tsunami. I wrote a little piece that was an op-ed column, was published in the International Herald Tribune and on the Times website, called Fukushima and Hiroshima, making the simple point it's the same stuff and the same fear of invisible contamination, though the proponents of nuclear energy try to create the idea, I would say illusion that somehow it's got nothing to do with the bomb and it's perfectly safe, when you've always got the problem of some kind of natural disaster as a potential occurrence, or human error, or fatigue in the equipment. So it's just painful to watch it all going on in Japan.
And you were a major activist, if I remember correctly, against nuclear bombs.
I was, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
I'm asking you for the audience that's watching this video.
Yeah, right. No, well, I became an anti-nuclear activist in a lot of places, but perhaps especially in the doctors' anti-nuclear movement. We traveled all over the country, and in major cities we warned of what would happen if a 1 or 10 megaton bomb were dropped on that city and destroyed, among everything else, the medical facilities, and we as doctors would be unable, as much as we might want to patch them up, so to speak, because first of all, we wouldn't be around any more than anybody else. Anyhow, that was a very powerful experience, because the American movement of Physicians for Social Responsibility became international. Movements began in countries throughout the world, Europe and Asia, and eventually, as you know, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War won a Nobel Prize, and I was active in the psychological side of all that. And that was satisfying, because I think we had some, the nuclear problem's far from solved and is as dangerous as it's ever been, but I think we had a certain influence on general consciousness, and it was a fairly conservative movement in that we try to use our medical and psychological knowledge to lay out what we took to be truths, and people were ready for it.
So if you wanted to just get on a pulpit right this moment and say something about nuclear energy to the planet, what would you want to say?
Nuclear energy is tempting, because it seems clean, and we're having so much difficulty with other forms of energy, and difficulty in generating enough energy from really safe and desirable forms of energy that don't pollute the environment. And there has been a turn toward nuclear energy, even among some environmentalists, for those reasons. But I am convinced that nuclear energy is too dangerous a technology to be used, and that's been just illustrated so tragically in Japan. And we had other examples like Chernobyl, and in a lesser but still threatening way, 3 Mile Island in this country. So I think wisdom lies in seeking other energy sources and in gradually phasing out nuclear energy. You know, it began in the Eisenhower administration as atoms for peace, and the whole idea of using this potentially all-destructive, this world-destroying technology for a life-enhancing purpose, that was attractive, a very attractive idea.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work that way, or at least it has the terrible danger of turning into the most destructive of all forms of energy source.
Right. Thank you for saying that. It sounds silly to say I agree, or at least that's my feeling too, that it's, I believe Germany is now pulling back from building nuclear.
You know, they have these risk assessment studies, but you can make a risk assessment studies and say it's 99% safe, but the destructive dimension is so great that when that safety breaks down, the consequences are all encompassing, and we see that in Japan. And there's both the real effects of radiation, the physical effects of radiation in producing symptoms of every kind, and ultimately leukemia and cancers, high incidence of them, and the nuclear fear, which is all enveloping. You know, nothing is more intense or pervasive when there's a nuclear accident or the threat of it. And that I found out in studying the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and there are parallel symptoms wherever radiation has made its way into the environment in significant amounts. And so, and I also interviewed people at 3 Mile Island, and those who did so at Chernobyl and certainly in Fukushima find that a terrifying fear of invisible contamination. So that's why I feel so strongly against nuclear energy.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that. So after Death in Life, what did you do? Nazi doctors, or was it the Vietnam?
The next, I guess, the next kind of major work was on Vietnam, interviewing Vietnam veterans, anti-war veterans mainly, and I was. This was part and parcel of another dimension of activism, because I come out strongly against the war with lots of other people, and had spoken out and began to talk to veterans in terms of what they'd been through, and to testify before congressional committees when they asked me about what it was doing to Americans, what that war was doing to Americans. But perhaps the most intense activity I had, and the source of much of my book, Home from the War, were the rap groups that I took part in with anti-war veterans, together with other professionals. But the veterans and I and other professionals helped form them, and they were a really impressive experience in which we, as so-called shrinks, that's what we were known as. It was vets and shrinks.
Right.
And everything was egalitarian, it was on a first-name basis, and the groups didn't belong to us, they belonged to the vets themselves. They had called us in. But it was both an anti-war expression and a source of knowledge about the war, and a way of helping people. And I think it helped us too. But, the veterans really came forward with all kinds of experiences that we learned a great deal about. And there was a positive side to that, because veterans could change very rapidly from that encounter with death, and an inability to believe in the justification of that saturation with death, or individual deaths of buddies, or the experience of killing the alleged enemy. From all that, it was the beginning of a profound personal change, and the rap group process could further that change. And within a matter of months or even weeks, these men changed significantly. Didn't mean that everything in them changed at once, but not only their view of the war, their view of masculinity, their relationships with girlfriends, with families, with friends, their work and holding on to a job, all that could change significantly. And it really questioned a lot of assumptions we had been taught in psychology and psychiatry, that everything after the first 6 years is superstructure. Doesn't work that way, or the so-called superstructure is our ongoing life, and there is that capacity for change. So there was a lot to learn from anti-war veterans about psychological experience, as well as interacting with them, having dialogues with them, having these rap groups, which benefited them a lot, and I think benefited us, the shrinks, because we learned a lot about things we had never experienced ourselves, and it was a way of contributing again to American consciousness about the Vietnam War.
And I was chuckling when you first said rap group, because I'm thinking about the young people who don't know what we mean by rap groups from that era.
Yeah.
They think it's the kind of, speaking musical group
Oh yes, right.
doing raps.
Yeah, that's true.
This was more of a informal share, unburden yourself and talk about your experiences.
I also learned a lot from the veterans about what I came to call an atrocity-producing situation. They could walk into a military environment, ordinary people who are no better morally than you or me, or no worse than you or me, and be capable of committing atrocities. And that tells one something about the power of really all-enveloping environments to influence behavior, and the degree to which people exposed to that environment can internalize those principles and those claimed truths. And I mean, that was very much true it's very true in war and in extreme environments, but of course it's true in any kind of extreme environment, including what you have been so concerned with, cultic environments. I think in our quest to understand individual behavior, we sometimes overlook the power of extreme environments to affect individual behavior.
Yeah, Philip Zimbardo's calls it the power of the situation.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
In my counseling work with people who've been negatively impacted or deceptively recruited into cults, I always show them some video of the Ash conformity study. With the lines where everyone in the group is 2/3 start giving the wrong answer to fit in with the group, and then the Milgram obedience study, the shock machine where the authority figures commanding people to electrocute another human being in less than an hour, and then the Zimbardo prison study where again the power of the uniform, the power of the situation, people were doing horrendous things in a very short period of time.
Those experiments, yes, illustrate the power of an environment to affect behavior in a very immediate and powerful way, where one functions in that environment over weeks and months and sometimes years. The process of internalization is greater, and one takes in and becomes part of, through much of one's being, that environment. And that's what happens in war, and many of the Vietnam veterans told me a lot about it, and as in all of these studies, taught me a great deal that I hadn't known.
I'm curious if the vets coming out of Afghanistan, Iraq, whether or not they are having similar experiences.
Well, there's, each war is different, and these wars are very different from the Vietnam War, but still the model of the Vietnam War and the atrocity-producing situation holds in some measure, in my belief, in each of those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, partly because, as different as they are counterinsurgency wars on very alien ground, where we're not, to say the least, fully accepted and sometimes deeply resented on many grounds, including religious grounds, and where it's enormously difficult, if not impossible, to tell civilians from combatants, or to get the, quotes, enemy to stand up and fight. That principle of an atrocity-producing situation is likely to occur, and we, of course, have had lots of atrocities in Iraq in particular, and in Afghanistan. And in that way, my work on the Vietnam War with anti-war veterans taught me about a particular kind of war in which an atrocity-producing situation prevails all too much of the time, but also about war making in general. You know, you have to understand Vietnam as two-headed, one in that special area and one just about war. You know, I once, and I write about this in my memoir briefly, I gave a little talk in New York before a religious group, I guess it was, about anti-war veterans. And a tall, rather elderly man came up to me and said, "Look, we had lots of atrocities in World War II. I was a Marine, we shot prisoners, they shot our prisoners. It was grotesque. You never heard much about that." And he, in fact, was influenced by what he had experienced, changed his religion from being a Catholic to being an Episcopalian, and in fact was Paul Moore, who became a great Episcopal leader and a bishop and a great anti-war and progressive theologian, a really great man who died just a few years ago. His point was, in a so-called good war, like World War II, meaning it had to be fought and there was real heroism and victory and all that, even in a so-called good war, there's atrocity and grotesqueness, and it's covered over often with the thrill of victory, but it's there, and it has to do with war. And in this regard, I had a lot of exchanges with Howard Zinn, maybe the great activist of our time, of my generation, and a good friend of mine. And he had been a bombardier in World War II. At the end of the war, a day or two before it ended, was on a bombing mission, a small French town, killed a few hundred people. He was curious later on about that mission, made time to go and study all the documents in that French town, and from the American military found out it was totally unnecessary. Probably arose, the mission, because of a competition between two American Air Force officers. So that sort of thing occurs in wartime when you're in a systematic killing mode. And all that taught me a great deal about war in general.
And after the Vietnam War, was it your book on psychohistory or Nazi doctors?
Well, in between I did shorter books of essays and wrote about psychohistory or...
Say about what psychohistory is, because I'm
well,
not sure.
Psychohistory sort of takes on a mystique it shouldn't have, and a lot of bad work has been done in its name. It really means the application of a psychological approach to historical questions, historical problems, and I've tried to do that by mostly the individual interview, and that has been a kind of baseline for most of my studies, where I have that experience and data of actual people talking to me in some depth, and I modified a clinical interview into becoming more of a dialogue, a back and forth in that way, in which the interviewer himself is more part of things and more responsible and has to answer to questions and issues raised to him. But a lot of the work and the influence on me comes from that of Erik Erikson, because his work he called psychohistorical. There's a little bit of a problem, maybe more than a little problem, in changing an adjective into a noun. Psychohistorical described that perspective. When you call it psychohistory, it sort of took on, in some people's mind, a kind of magic or claim to magic, red flag. But anyhow, so I don't use the noun too often, but it is the sphere in which I have done my work, applying a psychological approach to historical issues. And that's always best done, I think, with an empirical center of those interviews, and then one can carry those principles out more to the periphery, see how they apply more generally from the original interview, and then one can speculate further. At least one has that empirical data.
Great. And Nazi doctors, can you say?
Well, that came, yes, a little later in the late 70s, mostly. I spent a long time working on Nazi doctors, getting ready for it, carefully working out the method of doing it, and then writing about it, all of which was very difficult. But that really took me into direct hands-on evil, and really encounters with perpetrators. And of course, it would have been very intense work for anybody, but especially somebody who's Jewish, as I am. Again, I talk about the personal side of it in my memoir. It had its impact, but it was satisfying to do. I felt it was a kind of culmination of the various studies I had done, and I said, even in talking to friends after I published my book on Nazi doctors, that if I were to die soon after that was back in the late 80s, 1986 when I published the book, if I were to die soon after that, I'd be kind of ready because I'd done that study. But it also showed me in its findings how easy it was to become involved in evil, the socialization to evil. Again, it's the power of an environment and of a compelling, for many, ideology. The Nazi ideology was extreme in many ways at one end and bizarre, but it had a central message that appealed to the whole population, and that was revitalization. I interviewed Albert Speer. He told me how Hitler lectured at his university, the Technical University in Berlin, where he was studying architecture, and Hitler gave his relatively intellectual speech, historical speech, in which he said to his audience, "Follow me and you'll be strong again." And it wasn't just, of course it was Germany and militarily, but it was also psychologically. Because people were despairing, the economy had collapsed, they had no future, and he told them they could be strong again, they'd all have a future, they could be united. And that appealed to all layers of the population in different ways. And many of the Nazi doctors had that as a core of their belief without themselves being fanatical ideologues. They were ambitious and they were corruptible. There were extreme ideologues like Mengele and others at the center, but the average doctor I interviewed or heard about had this influence by the Nazis, had joined the party, but didn't necessarily know about or embrace the more extreme dimensions of Nazi ideology. Anyhow, I did that study, and I saw that whole project as a kind of pseudo-medical, a pseudo-biological project. And Hitler had written in Mein Kampf, and there was at the heart of Nazi ideology this idea that the Nordic race is the only culture-creating race.
Yeah, the master.
Had been weakened by the, quotes, Jewish race. And something had to be done about the source of danger to the Nordic race, most of the Jews and other inferior races, in order to cure the Nordic race. You had that whole medical, pseudo-medical, pseudo-biological constellation, and that's why the Nazi doctors were so central to that whole process, and often were, as in Auschwitz, directly involved and even in charge of the killing process.
Yeah, if I may just say for those who aren't familiar with the book, that the frame, at least my memory of reading it, was that how could doctors who were sworn to protect life, heal people, be corrupted to do this horrible medical experiments and other. And it was the first time that I saw in your work the concept of doubling.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you say a little bit?
With the Nazi doctors, there was a reversal of healing and killing. And the idea was eventually that the killing was necessary to heal the Nordic race. I spoke of doubling as one of the mechanisms that enabled the Nazi doctors to do what they did. For instance, a doctor at Auschwitz in Poland would spend 5 or 6 days a week doing selections, supervising the killing process, and at the center of it, while trying to still think of himself as a doctor, he might go for weekends or furloughs, short trips from Poland to Germany and spend a few days there, where he'd be an ordinary husband and father. And it was as if he functionally had a second self. Right. The relatively benign self that enabled him to be a husband and father, and then the killing self, or Auschwitz self, as I called it, which he had adapted to in his socialization to evil. And it was clearly a form of dissociation. Exactly. And dissociation really simply means one part of the mind separating from the other part of the mind. And I think that happens with extreme behavior. You can think of mob bosses who can be pillars of the community and give money to their churches and care about their kids and that they're following straight and narrow path and getting a good education or whatever, but their everyday business is killing.
Right.
And so the self can divide itself in this way. And I called it doubling rather than simply calling it splitting, as is often, and it is what in psychoanalytic jargon is called splitting. It's very similar. But doubling conveyed the idea that one could have an entire entity in oneself. Right. The Nazi doctors, the Auschwitz self enabled them not only to kill, but to adapt to the ugly environment of Auschwitz with its heavy drinking and nasty rhetoric and its deep corruption at all levels. So you could form a sub-self around that whole killing process, and it became a very sustained part of you. It was holistic. And in that sense, doubling seemed the proper term.
Yeah, and I can self-report that that's closest to my experience of being a good Moonie who is going to amend the Constitution, make it a capital offense for people to have sex with people outside of the church, and basically commit mass genocide to purify the master race, which would be Korean, essentially. We would be grafted onto the Koreans. But I mean, Moon was my true parent, and my real parents were my physical parents, and it was like two Steves.
Yeah.
There was the old Steve who wrote poetry and short stories and was a good Jewish little boy, and then this self that was created that believed that the Jews had to die in the Holocaust to purify the race, to the world race, and that was prepared to do Zig Heil and anything that I was told by my masters to do. And that's partly what so horrified me when I woke up
Yes.
from my trance, and I had to confront that self that had been created, who loved the power, loved that people, would bow to me when I would, enter, and the idea that I would run my own country one day for the fatherland.
It's a bit mind-boggling.
It's horrifying.
So it's part of the human repertoire. In other words, we can dissociate in various ways, and calling this way doubling is really describing a human potential. And of course it's troubling because it's a potential for adapting to evil. It's also true, though, that one could speak of doubling among survivors of the Holocaust. In other words, it could be used for life-enhancing purposes, in that you just had to adapt to an environment more overwhelmingly brutal than any you had known or thought you could, in any sense, survive in or take part in. And they did. And so, and then of course when they came out, they changed.
Very good point. I just read the memoir, some of the beginning memoirs of my father-in-law, my first wife, who was a survivor of Poland. And he had never wanted to talk about his experiences all these decades, and now he's in his 80s and he's starting to write it down. And this is a man who survived. His father and uncle were taken by the Nazis. He was hiding under the bed, and they made a distraction, and they were taken away and killed. These are people who dove into the sewage canals to get out of the ghetto multiple times in the refuse.
It's amazing.
Multiple times had to use adhesive over his skin of his penis to try to make it look like he hadn't been circumcised. Just story after story is coming out, and this is a man who went to MIT, became a PhD, became chairman of his department, a world-renowned person who had a family, had a life, but just compartmentalized this horror. And so I think that's so correct that this can be a survival skill too for
that's right. And it can be. That's right. And what that also suggests is that in these horrors that I've studied, there have been examples of extraordinary resilience. You just described it in your former father-in-law, and I encountered it in Auschwitz survivors who moved me with what they had been through and what they had done after that in somehow taking it in and reordering it in their psyches. Resilience is the word, and when I interviewed Auschwitz survivors, especially Jewish survivors, I identified with them because it could have been me, that they were a little bit old, they were maybe a decade older than I was, but their backgrounds were similar, and it was a chance event of history that my grandparents managed to leave their shtetls in Russia and make their way to this country in the last couple of decades of the 19th century, so that my parents could be born here and I could be born here, and in that sense had the protection and privileged life that one could have compared to what they had gone through. And I often ask myself whether, had I been in their position, I could have behaved as well, because they were, in some cases, quite extraordinary and very moving in helping other people to survive with almost nothing to offer but some kindness and reassurance.
Right. Well, in just listening to you the last few moments in particular, I'm struck by your capacity for empathy, to step into people's shoes and imagine you being there.
When you're studying these destructive, extremely destructive events, you have to, I guess I've found that you just have to let yourself enter into them in order to learn anything about them. You can't stand back, remove from them, and ask questions from above. But at the same time, in doing these studies, I also had to protect myself, recognize over time that, you know, I had my limitations. I couldn't immerse myself 24 hours a day in this kind of thing. And had to have lots of other things in my life.
Right, to balance yourself. So you've been very generous with your time. I'd like to just ask you to talk a little bit about destroying the world to save it, and that study of Aum Shinrikyo, and kind of tying thought reform and the psychology of totalism to cults explicitly, if you don't mind.
Well, Aum Shinrikyo was...
Kitty.
Aum Shinrikyo, in some ways, maybe they were not the most evil group I studied, because certainly the Nazi doctors won that distinction hands down.
Yeah, but let's say that this is the Japanese cult that did the sarin gassing in the subways and shot the chief of police.
1995, right. Aum Shinrikyo called.
Shoko Asahara.
Yes, and so if they weren't the most evil group I studied, they were the most bizarre. They were the most extreme, and they were the most totally apocalyptic group I'd ever studied, because they engaged in not only apocalyptic projections. There are many cults and many groups, religious groups, that expect the end of the world as God's way of purifying the world and recreating the world in a much greater spiritual fashion. In the case of Aum Shinrikyo, they engaged in what was called by the ancient rabbis forcing the end. Forcing the end. The ancient rabbis, so it is written, so I learned because I'm no great authority on this, but they debated whether, since the Messiah in Jewish thought, his return has to be preceded by all kinds of chaos and violence, should one join in the violence in order to
speed it up,
facilitate that return, speed up the return.
Scary thought.
And the rabbis in their wisdom decided no, that the timing should be God's, not ours. But
yeah, I thought you're supposed to plant a tree. If you think the Messiah is coming, plant the tree. At least that's what Judaism I grew up with.
But you know, Asahara, the guru of Aum Shinrikyo, had no such restraint. So the doctrine that he promulgated was that we're in the battle for Armageddon every day of our lives. And the sarin gas was partly a defensive maneuver because the police were closing in on them. They had committed a number of crimes. But it was also part of that apocalyptic plan of forcing the end, because they had been trying to create, which they did to some extent, though crudely, chemical and biological weapons, and sought nuclear weapons unsuccessfully, fortunately. The general plan being to initiate a major disaster in Tokyo, and then the Japanese would think the Americans had done it, the Americans would think the Japanese had done it. That would start World War III.
And the CIA and the Masons and the Jews, he was...
All that was part of it, part of their list. But in any case, it would initiate World War III, which would then bring about a biblical Armageddon. So it's...
And he was Jesus and Buddha.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, what was interesting about... I mean, there are a lot of things that are interesting about Asahara, but he practiced early forms of Buddhism, which spilled over into Hinduism, and was a skillful religious teacher, a skillful teacher of yoga, a rather effective guru initially in many ways. But for his Armageddon narrative, he chose Christianity and really connected himself with Christian Armageddon. because that's the most powerful end of the world narrative. And that was at the heart of Aum Shinrikyo. And of course I interviewed former disciples of Asahara, and they were mostly college graduates or college students. They were bright young people.
Yes.
And they said interesting things. They were appalled when they learned about the violence of the cult. Not all of them were in on it, because only those closest to the Guru were. But they still longed for those magnificent days when they were thriving under the Guru's influence. What they called their mystical experiences, which he initiated in them through his, well, sometimes making use of rapid breathing, deoxygenation, and which has been a mystical method for some time, but also drugs and other means, and then they would have this experience in their visions of total merger with the Guru, and in a sense disappearing as an entity with its own autonomy, in being dissolved into the Guru, so to speak. And these were treasured, even though they looked back on it and saw it as part of a wrong-headed, if not evil, project. So that shows some of the power of a Guru, and the apocalyptic promise, which seems much more visionary, enters into that individual psychological experience, and the whole thing takes on enormous force and takes over the whole psyche. But of course, I also learned in studying Aum Shinrikyo how a guru like Asahara can move in and out of psychosis, and he apparently did. And what became really most threatening to him was his loss of disciples, those who had been closest to him. And when they turned against him, he was likely to move over the edge. But he could stay capable of organization and leadership and guruism long enough to do a lot of harm, and to keep going that small cult which had so much influence on Japanese society and developed so much power.
It was a small cult, but my recollection was they had a $2 billion computer company, and they had people in the military, people in the police. The youngest Japanese lawyer in Japan was a member. They had really infiltrated.
They infiltrated all kinds of groups. There was an enormous energy to them. And again, that apocalyptic vision is a great source, or bound up with much of that energy. They had enormously effective businesses. They developed a considerable technology. They took in a lot of money through their religious practices and selling, and
they were selling his bathwater and his fingernails,
the Guru, and headsets, the Guru's brainwaves.
Attune the brainwaves. I remember that.
God, they raised a tremendous amount of money. Again, this kind of totalist practice and totalist immersion on the part of intelligent people, can bring about enormous consequences, and they were a cult of about 10,000 people, of whom less than 1,000 were close to the Guru, and only a few hundred lived around him. And they had a lot more in the Soviet Union, but it was difficult to calculate numbers with that. And yet they did all this, and they produced versions of weapons of mass destruction. So the motivation can be extreme when you see yourself as the true visionaries. And what I've learned is that there is always a claim to the deepest kind of virtue. Even and especially in the case of the Nazis, whom incidentally, or not so incidentally, Aum Shinrikyo and Asahara deeply admired. He was a great admirer of the Nazis. But the Nazis taught one that you cannot kill, or it is almost impossible to kill, very large numbers of people, except for the claim to virtue. And Aum Shinrikyo, of course, claimed ultimate virtue because they were the true religious remnant who could survive Armageddon and bring about perfect purity based on Aum Shinrikyo's spiritual doctrine to the new world experience.
And the former members I spoke with told me that the belief was that everyone who would be killed by the sarin, they'd be enlightened automatically because it was the guru's blessing.
Well, that's right.
So it was, they weren't really killing them; they were sending them right to heaven.
There was a principle they called POA, which was, as you said, if an enlightened person or a spiritually advanced person is to, he or she could be justified in killing a spiritually backward person who would have a higher spiritual level as a consequence in his or her reincarnation. And of course, it's not exactly a noble doctrine by our standards. And some people whom I interviewed were amazed that they could come to such a belief. And just as you were amazed that you could have the beliefs you mentioned in the Moonies, in that immersion. And one couldn't, as an intelligent person, hold such beliefs unless one thought oneself in a realm of higher virtue.
Right. Yeah, no, for me, I've counseled so many people who are valedictorians and just brilliant, creative inventors, and I guess my thought is the more mind you have, the more imagination you have, the more passion to develop yourself and to change the world, the more it can be twisted by some charismatic figure who takes some kind of role of father or mother and kind of age regresses you back to some...
Both a parent and a deity.
Yes.
That's a tough combination to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. So as we wrap up this fascinating conversation, I thank you so much. Is there any last words you'd like to share?
Well, I put it in very modest terms that, I mean, not about me, but in terms of limits, people, especially since I've been an activist and still am in my life, people get very disappointed, students or friends. Okay, we demonstrated, we spoke out, and still these evils exist. There's nuclearism and the construction of nuclear weapons. There are fascist or neo-fascist groups in various parts of the world. There are cults. There are wars. What good does all the demonstrating and activism do? And isn't it all hopeless? My answer is no, it's not hopeless. One keeps at it, and there's never one moment of satori where everything comes into place, but rather it's a continuous process, and one tries one's best, and one wins a few rounds and loses a few battles and goes on, and that's important, and everything counts. Everything counts.
I really appreciate that wisdom. And I guess it brings back in my mind to some metaphor about the human body and the immune system, and that somehow people who've lost their freedom, like myself in a mind control situation, we so cherish our freedom. We so cherish being alive and having another chance to do something. And so there's a lot of us out there that have experienced slavery, psychological slavery, in some cases physical slavery, and that we don't want to go down passively.
Well, that's right, and I guess when one has experienced that, one has had a a valuable kind of immersion that can be used and can give one energy for combating it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's great. So I'm going to turn this off. Just...
This might have been more what I looked like when we met. Taken some time ago.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you so much. I read it.
You're very welcome.
So, and you're moving back to New York?
Yeah, first I'm going to the Cape, and I'll be there for probably a couple of months, and then I'll see when I move. When it all works out. So.
Great. Can I ask for just a picture of us together? Just a short thing? Is it possible? I'll just, how about if you want to stand? Okay. Great. And that way I can, if I'm standing next to you, then I can take a shot. And I want to thank you again for helping to save my life, really, and direct me.
It means a lot to me as well.
Thank you. And here's the back cover of Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Look at that face. Robert Jay Lifton. Who would know? That's on a copy of, and this is a picture that he chose for his memoirs. Robert Jay Lifton, Witness to an Extreme Century. Thank you so much.